Hello, dear viewers or listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Student Podcast recorded by students of the Political Psychology and International Relations course at the Faculty of Social Sciences of Charles University. My name is Michal Mandak, and I will be your host for today. This episode will concern itself with the rationality, or lack thereof, of Vladimir Putin, the current president of the Russian Federation, in connection with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Last year, the lives of all people in Eastern and Central Europe were to some extent derailed. The Russian Federation has attacked its neighboring country under the nebulous guise of denazification through a special military operation. What was presumably expected to be a few days' invasion has now been going on for more than a year. Over time, the war has come to be called Putin's War, and the face of President Putin has appeared depicted on the internet as well as in reality in various forms of caricature or disfigurement. Vladimir Putin has become a focus for people's outbursts of rage, being seen as the sole motivator of the invasion. In different phases of the war, he has been called a criminal, a madman, but also a mad genius, a cold calculating machine. Could either of these views be true, or are we perhaps assigning too much agency to Vladimir Putin himself and ignoring the wider Russian elite? When discussing international relations, there is always the problem of our level of analysis. Should we consider states to be holistic rational actors in international relations? Should we consider their inner workings? Or should we consider their individual leaders and their specific input into negotiations, rhetoric, and representation? Is the power in Russia concentrated enough in one person for us to consider Vladimir Putin as the sole actor behind Russia's invasion into Ukraine? And if Vladimir Putin is the most important element in Russia's decision making process, how rational is he? Was the invasion a calculated risk that simply went wrong, or was it an impulsive decision? We like to look at individuals as rational actors, expecting them to always act in their best interest. But from psychological research, we know that humans overestimate their rationality and that a big part of our decision making is processed unconsciously, and the rational reasonings as to why we made a particular decision are thought up only ad hoc. Could Vladimir Putin's decisions be motivated by more irrational needs, like hunger for power, imperialism, or illusions of grandeur? Russia has been basing its modern identity in its contribution to the Second World War and its military power. How likely is it that the invasion of Ukraine was a risky attempt at re-establishing Russia's image as a military power in the modern world? What about Russia's citizens? Could the entire operation have been employed to paint over Russia's internal problems? How do the public's opinions and moods affect Russia's decision makers? Do they listen to the public opinion, or do they expect the citizens to fall in line with their cues? Is it possible for citizens of an authoritarian country to influence their leaders' policies? What is the role of propaganda in the relationship of political elites and their citizens? And could we be talking about a cult of personality in Vladimir Putin's case? To help me explore these topics and hopefully answer at least some of these questions, I have with me today Professor Sergei Medvedev, who is a professor at the Faculty of Arts of the Charles University and the author of the book The Return of the Russian Leviathan, which has won the Pushkin House Prize for in the year 2020. Thank you very much for coming, Professor.
Thank you.
So, to start off with the very question of can we actually talk about Putin's war? How much is the invasion a product of Vladimir Putin's individual decision making? In one of the essays in your book, The Purveyors of Threats, you mention how post Crimea Russia is essentially controlled by Siloviki, oligarchs and bureaucrats from the power ministries who endlessly manufacture threats. To quote you specifically, you say that the emergence of this market, the market of threats to the states, has been dictated by the character of the political elite of Putin's third term. In place of Politburo 2.0, which was made up of representatives of the power ministries, the Siloviki, bureaucrats and oligarchs, the leadership is now totally dominated by the Siloviki. As the political commentator Konstantin Gazu writes, all the key decisions in the past year have been taken by a close circle of representatives of the FSB. So my question is, you know, how much is it Vladimir Putin himself calling the shots, and how much is it his surroundings?
It is both. Basically, there are several levels at which we should understand this. First of all, the decision was Putin and his close encirclement, maybe three, four people around him. The decision to begin the war came as a surprise to much of the Russian elite, including the same Siloviki. If there was a famous seating of the Security Council 2 days before the start of the war, I think on the 22nd of February 2022, at which Putin announced that Russia is going to recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which effectively meant the beginning of the war, of the full-scale war. And you could see that much of the Russian, top elite, including head of the Security Council, the heads of the FSB, they were visibly shocked by this decision, and it clearly wasn't coordinated with them. Moreover, there are many rumors that the army leadership, including especially the chief of staff, Valery Gerasimov, were strongly opposed to this war, expecting problems into which Russia ran later on, the insufficiency of the size of the attacking group of forces, and so on. So in a sense, the very decision, the final decision, was taken by Putin personally. And the system is now very personalistic. There's no politics in Russia as such. It's just one person, and it's more like a court. He acts like a tsar, and there is a tsar's court. There's a close encirclement around him, and all other institutions are basically fake. They are null. They are just appearances, like the State Duma, the ministries. They are all following the orders they receive from the administration of the president. So in this sense, yes, this is very much a Putin's war. However, there is a second part to this answer, in a sense that this war has been envisaged, planned, and prepared in Russia for at least 15 years before that. I would date the early preparations to this war in like 2007, maybe even earlier, to the first Maidan of 2004, because there were many warnings. And it's not, you have to understand, it's not just the war against Ukraine. It's just the first step in what Putin sees as the war, the world war, the war with the outside world, the war with the West. First of all, Ukraine is just a testing ground. And Russia has been preparing to this war. You can remember the famous Munich speech by Vladimir Putin in February 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, in which he announced that Russia has legitimate interests in its own sphere of influence, and it doesn't want to interfere, the West to interfere in the post-Soviet space, and so on. And then you can remember the aggression, the war against Georgia in 2008. And then, of course, the beginning of the war goes back to 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of Donbass. So, and then also in the meanwhile, in the same 15 years, Russia spent close to $1 trillion on rearming itself. There was a huge army reform led by then Minister of Defense Anatoly Serdyukov. There was an immense rearmament project, which, Russia allegedly was supposed to be the second biggest army, the second strongest army in the world, which effectively turned out not to be. But anyway, the money was spent. So Russia has been preparing to war on all fronts. So in this sense, it's not just a spontaneous decision or a caprice of one man. I think the final decision was taken by Putin, but the preparation was done for years. And Russia has been insisting that Ukraine does not have the right to exist as an independent state. There was a long anti-Ukraine campaign in the Russian media, among the top Russian politicians, saying that Ukraine is not a nation; it's just a mistake. Its territories have been given to her by Russia. Ukrainian language is an incomplete language, and so on. So this kind of a racist and Nazist propaganda has been going on for years. And finally, the third part of this answer is that now, after 1 year of the war, 1 year and 2 months and 3 months now. Um, it's the war of entire Russia. The entire country is participating in it, willingly or unwillingly. The elite, the administrative apparatus, the oligarchs, the oil industry, the banks, the TV, the population. Millions of people have been affected by, either going to the war or their close relatives have gone to war or have been killed or wounded. By some accounts, there is about 250 and 300,000 people of Russians who live like the losses in this war. So it's already in its second year. It's a national war, and the nation participates in it, produces this war, normalizes this war. The war is a way of life for Russia now. So yeah, this is a long answer, but the question is, it's like the start was a decision by Putin, but now it's an entire Russia's war.
Uh, you've touched on a lot of topics in that answer that I would like to sort of develop. You mentioned that it was a pre-prepared war in some way, in cooperation with the industry and other groups of interest. So that would be my next question. To what extent are corporations or industrial interests and other groups of interest, like religion, for example, we saw that the head of the Orthodox Church, I believe, supported Vladimir Putin strongly in the war. So, how would you say different groups of interests influence Russia's politics and Vladimir Putin's decision making personally?
They're not influencing anything. They are just following this general guidelines. We have come to a point in Russian politics when groups of interest uh, have lost any significant clout on decision making. In a sense, there's only, as you correctly pointed out in the beginning, there's the group of Siloviki. And of course, there's the power ministers, the power agencies, which have the a big role in the administrative apparatus. But they are also following in the same line in the sense that they cannot really change the course of politics, right? The course of politics has its own logic. In a sense, Putin is a hostage to it. So everyone is participating in this game and trying to profit. So the interest in just following this discourse of war, like for instance, the military-industrial complex, of course, is profiting hugely from the new military procurement orders, and we don't know now, but probably at least a third of the Russian budget goes to this war. And that's like in the new budget, I think it's over 20%. But then they are like hidden uh, articles of the state budget, so we can really say about that a third of the state budget goes to war, and of course there are many beneficiaries in this. So I would say that it's not them moving the war, but they are profiting from the war.
Mhm.
So there's a massive institutional force that is interested in it. And there are also some new leaders, some regional leaders, some local enthusiasts and activists that have been promoted by the war discourse that organize, this military festivals and displays and, writing military poetry, staging new theater plays, writing songs. So there's a cultural industry also, the propaganda industry, which is attached to this war. So I have to understand this is a whole machine working towards this war, and it's not just one man and the population observing us. It's everyone, because Russia is a very like state-oriented country, and so when a state decides on a certain course, people are participating in this. So as long as the state is at war, the nation and the population has to somehow participate, profit from this war as well.
Uh, so you would, if I could like reiterate, maybe is it sort of a depersonalized system where not even Vladimir Putin himself has the overall control, but sort of happens itself with everyone trying to profiteer of the state?
In a sense, yes, yes. I even think that if Putin goes away now, the war may continue.
Mhm.
There are other people at play. There are the military commanders. There's a disenchanted population. There are the likes of Prigozhin, Evgeny Prigozhin, who is now growing into a very significant figure of his own. They are the military, the mid-rank military commanders who want to revenge for our guys, for their comrades lost in battle, and heavy losses among the military, among the also professional, qualified military. So, yeah, there are big forces at play. So, as long as Russia has the arms and the scores of the people willing to fight, it will continue fighting even without Putin. So the thing is, it's a personalist autocracy, right? But it's also a largely depersonalized machine in which it's its own steam, its own logic. So, and Putin also has to follow the rules of this machine because he's sitting on the top of the pyramid of various institutional interests. Here's the arbiter of this interests. And basically they are moving this machine of war forward.
Uh, so to come back to the problem of the decision of who made the decision, you said it was Vladimir Putin himself, but now you sort of spoke about how it's more of a an institutionalized process. So how much was the decision to actually invade Ukraine in 2022 a rational decision? Because it was supposed to be, from what we know, a few days military operation from the way it was set up. It seems so, and now it's been going on for more than a year. So, what was it a case of a rational decision made on bad intelligence? But you said it was very much pre-prepared, so one would have guessed.
Mhm. Yes. Well, first, to just the summarizing answer to your question of who is making decisions. I'm now sort of discovered this metaphor. I'm using this a lot. The metaphor of an avalanche. This war is an avalanche. And, the avalanche is basically an objective force. And it's prepared for weeks. Imagine you're on a cliff. There's a valley, there's a cliff above the valley. And there have been snowfalls for the several weeks, heavy snowfalls. And a big mass of snow has built on a cliff above the valley. Now, the avalanche may start or may not start. There should be a certain trigger to start off the avalanche because probably the conditions can be favorable, the snow may melt, and this all, heavy mass of snow will eventually melt away. But the chances are very high for an avalanche. And then there's one, stupid skier who goes on top of the avalanche. And, just one passage of the skier, and he cuts a break in the avalanche, and this huge millions of tons of snow just go down in the valley. Now, the question is whether this avalanche is objective or subjective. It takes a subjective decision to start it off, the stupidity of one skier. But then once the avalanche gets started, it's objective, it's a force of nature, right? So we have this combination of a subjective human decision or human mistake, and then the objective force of nature. So war is now for Russia a force of nature. So everyone is going down with the avalanche. It carries people with it. It will probably bury the whole world beneath it. But it's so unstoppable, right? So, and of course, people are trying, somehow somebody's struggling with this avalanche and somebody already, starting to work inside the avalanche. Okay, if it goes down with such force, I can gain something. Now to the rationality of the skier on top to this decision. He of course had his own rationality. It would be stupid just to think that he is, did it out of his own caprice. He thought it would be like Crimea, because the annexation of Crimea was the same quick operation. 3 days, and then the West and the world are presented with a fait accompli. You take it and you have to accept it. And he thought this will be an easy, like 3 day, 1 week walk of the Russian army because he was severely misinformed by the Russian intelligence. Russia had a huge network, has built a huge network over the past couple of decades of agents. The entire FSB was working inside Ukraine. And they were basically supposed to place agents of influence inside Ukraine army, Ukrainian police, Ukrainian politicians, so that they would, when the Russia invades, they would be receptive. They would topple the Kiev regime, the Kiev government, and they would accept Russia. And but actually, they failed all this job. But they reported to Moscow that everything is going according to plan. It happened as it always happens in Russia. Like people don't do anything, people screw up in their jobs. But the important thing in Russia is to report correctly. You just should not really upset your superiors. So people were reporting that everything is going fine. And then when the invasion starts, it's not going fine. Russia suddenly sees that there is, Ukraine has built up a very capable army, one of the strongest armies in the world, that it shows a fierce and very qualified resistance, that the population is not receiving Russian troops with flowers. And, already in the first week, the war was lost in the first week, since it's failed as a blitzkrieg. And Russian army was not prepared uh, for the um, for the longer war, because the troops had this parade uniform. Basically, they all ironed their parade uniform for victory parade in Kiev 1 week later. So and then it all started to fail. The plan failed, and then since the plan failed, it all went on the wrong track. A track which is very irrational, which doesn't have, it has its own rationality. It has an institutional logic. It has, the stupid logic of the Soviet war making from the 20th century. They're doing this war like Marshal Zhukov was doing the war in the 20th century. Just send more soldiers, like stuff more soldiers in the machine, and we will eventually overpower them because the enemy would not have as many cannon fodder as we have. So it's not entirely irrational, but it's completely wrong. It's just a train going full speed on the wrong track, and will eventually hit the wall, smash itself against the wall. So it's once again, so it had some rationality in the beginning, and it did not have enough rationality to adjust its plan, to change the game plan, to say, okay, we failed, we withdraw, let's negotiate. And the moment was lost. And now Ukraine wants to get back its entire territory, and it's very hard to do, and the war is at a stalemate. So yeah, it's a failed decision making, and also the thing is that the machine called Vladimir Putin has no back. It never retracts. It has no reverse speed. Vladimir Putin never showed that he can stop, he can retract, he can regroup. So he's always going straight forward, and that's his weakness.
So would you say there could also be an element of like a sunk costs fallacy that we've already invested so much, so we can't give it up now?
Yes, absolutely. And that's also what the Russian population says to itself. The
Mhm.
war is not going according to plan. We're probably in trouble, but we've invested so much that we've lost human lives. The most common line in Russia these days, if we started, we have to finish it off. It's bad, it's going wrong, it's not going according to plan, but we have to finish it off. So Russia is captive to its own wrong decision. And the population is also captive to the mythology which is living in. Because now, if an average man in Russia stops and says, wait a second, we've been wrong all the way, people cannot admit to having been wrong for the past year, right? Because then the entire world collapses. If Russia admits that, we are the real fascists, we have committed crimes against humanity in Bucha, in Irpin, in Mariupol, in Kherson, elsewhere, we have to be answerable to this. Like, it will blow up people's minds. They cannot admit this into their heads. So people are really hostages to, first, their own decision making, and second, to the myths of their propaganda.
Uh, I'll come back to the problem of why. You have already spoken how the war on Ukraine is only the first step in a war on the West or in general on the world. But there's still the question of what's the motivation. My personal hypothesis, and from what I remember you speaking about 2 years back in Prague, I believe, at a panel. It revolved a lot around how modern Russia bases its identity in the World War II victory and in general in military power. And my personal hypothesis is that since Vladimir Putin, or in general the Russian elite, has seen this image of Russia as a superpower, as a military superpower, failing, they try to regain this image by quickly capturing, or presumably quickly capturing, Ukraine. It sort of ties into the problem of the domain of losses in psychology, where when we perceive that we are losing something, we are more likely to risk, uh, to accept risks to get back to the status quo. So, do you think it could have been perceived? Could Russia have perceived itself as losing its image and therefore trying to regaining by doing a fairly reckless operation?
Yeah, more or less, this is true. I think the core problem is that Russia is inadequate in the modern world. Russia does not fit in the 21st century. It's a clumsy, outdated, archaic, overstretched empire. And an empire which was already outdated for much of the 20th century. It tried to break up twice, in 1917 and in 1991. In both of the times, it didn't really break up completely. It then sort of reassembled. There was a post-imperial remission, one by Stalin and another by Putin. So, and in the end, in the 2020s, we still have this huge, ineffective, state-dominated, archaic empire, which is painfully inadequate in the world. Now, feeling this, Russia had a chance to reform. Russia had a good 30 years after the post-Soviet collapse, and the rather good starting conditions. The still working Soviet infrastructure, a rather educated population with relatively good healthcare, like decent human capital. It had the benevolence of the West. Everyone liked Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union after the Cold War. Well, maybe not so much Eastern Europe, but the bigger world really appreciated the end of the Cold War, and Russia was everyone's darling. So Russia was in the course of reform in the 1990s, and then it screwed it all up. It wasted the huge oil profits it was getting in the 21st century because of the high of the constantly high oil prices. There was the plunder of money. There was a plunder of the windfall oil profits. There was actually the plunder of the opportunity to reform itself. So, and Putinism and this war is a result of the failure. It's an attempt to reverse the inevitable decline of Russia in the world affairs, on the world scene. And Putinism is a product of ressentiment, of resentment, much like German Nazism was, and an attempt to rewrite the global rules of the game, to rather than adjusting to the world order, to the liberal world order. Russia wants to ruin the liberal world order and try to create, well, not really a new world order, but the world chaos, in which it will be one of the key forces because it possesses military power and an authoritarian government, which allows it to act irrespective of the population and the willingness to fight and to die and to inflict damage on other countries. So Russia thought of rewriting the global rules of the game, and it started this war as in an attempt to provoke global havoc, to provoke global chaos. and to make the European Union, NATO, and specifically the United States fail. And Russia is not, it is not completely irrational, because if we look at this war from the perspective of the non-Western world, I think many people in the world would like to see the US fail. Many people would like to see, actually, China is waiting in the sidelines. India is also waiting in the sidelines. Turkey, the emerging powers of Brazil, other ones, Latin America. Not that they are so like Putin so much or hate Ukraine, but they would like the West to fail. And what is at stake in this war is really the capacity of the West to maintain the world order. And I don't know whether the West has the will and the capacity and the stamina to hold in Ukraine, because we're definitely into a long haul. The war may drag on for another 5 years, 10 years, we don't know. It's a protracted conflict. And Russia under Putin will be staying there. Unless this country is destroyed or occupied, it will be doing war and making this war. It will not go to peace with Ukraine. And the West may change. There could be a change of presidency in the United States. Trump may come over, like DeSantis. The Republicans can stop supporting Ukraine. European governments, European population will be tired of this war. The Ukrainian refugees, millions of Ukrainian refugees, Europe is taking and taking more, but who knows what happens in 2 years or 3 years? And Putin knows this, because he knows that Biden will not be there in 3 years' time, that all the European leaders will not be there in 3 years' time, but he will be there in 3 years' time, and maybe in 5 years' time. So he hopes to endure, and then eventually this will be a protracted conflict, and then the world will agree with Russia's permanent annexation of Crimea and maybe of Donbass, and then basically the West will have lost. And then China will be very interested to see this, because China will then attempt to take Taiwan. Then there could be just a host of other conflicts across the world. So basically, this is a war about the future of the world. That's a war about the future of the West, the role of the West in this world. But I'm not sure that the Western political elite is quite aware of this.
Well, that touches on my next question, and that is, when and how does the war end? Because what you describe is a very ambitious plan to sort of throw the whole world system into chaos. But we have seen Russia sort of fail, as we already spoke about. The idea that they could take over Ukraine within days has failed, and now anything less will be seen as a defeat. But on the other hand, Ukrainians will not want to probably give up at least Donetsk and Donbass, and they will probably try to restore Crimea as well. So, how do we even? Is there even a possibility of a compromise that wouldn't sort of carry over the resentment into future, well, generations even?
Yes, I think that's precisely. I think we'll go through a series eventually as the war digs deep down. Well, okay, we cannot exclude the victorious scenario, that Russia is really much weaker. Russia may plunge into civil war, and we have seen early signs of this with, bold statements by Prigozhin, and so on. Putin may suddenly die, or somebody can help him to die, assist him in dying, as happened sometimes in Russian history. Yes, and we cannot exclude the Ukraine's total victory, restoring its territory to like 1991 borders, to 2013 borders, with Crimea, full Crimea, and Donbass. However, as you rightly say, this will not end the war for Russia, because there will be a resentful Russia. So my sad message, my bad message, is that the Russian system may survive after Putin and after the defeat of the war. So Russia will be deeply insulted, resentful country. and it will be just like Germany after World War I, with the Weimar syndrome. So Russia may plunge even into deeper fascism and ressentiment and dreams of the revenge. So, in this sense, the problem will not be solved just by the victory of Ukraine, and the problem will not be solved even by, trial over Putin. Uh, there are examples in the world, like for instance, Iraq under Saddam remained under Saddam for another 13 years after his defeat in Kuwait. In Serbia, Milosevic ended up in The Hague and died in The Hague. But however, the country is still deeply resentful and not a member of the European Union, and still, well, I don't think there's a new war in the making, the war over Kosovo, but still, the the Serbia problem, the Serbia injury is not healed, is not cured. So Russia is much, much bigger. Serbia with nuclear weapons. So yes, the real end of the war should be something like Germany in 1945. We need to have a full defeat of Russia, the demilitarization of Russia, denuclearization of Russia. Russia should be relieved of its nuclear potential, of its nuclear threat. Denazification, deputinization, a profound reform of the Russian state, of a profound decolonization of Russia, of the Russian territory. So something, the same process what Germany went through in 1945, which eventually, in a matter of decades, made Germany a normal, peace-loving country and a founding member of the European community. So, but I can hardly imagine such conditions for Russia: an occupying force, external administration, division into zones of influence, re-education of the people, showing Russians movies about Bucha, and so on and so forth. So, ensuring a Marshall Plan, economic prosperity for Russia, ensuring at the same time repayments for Ukraine. I don't know. I don't think that the world is capable of doing such a reinstatement project for the entire Russia in the world. So, in this sense, I'm afraid we're in for a very long, protracted decay for the country, which is the most likely scenario for me. Of course, once again, I do not exclude the more positive scenarios, a new Gorbachev, a new reform in Russia, the country, happily reorganizing itself. Miracles happen. Miracles happen in Russian history as well, as like the one in the late 80s with Mikhail Gorbachev. But it would be stupid to sort of to build your policy and your predictions and your forecast on the miracle, on the belief in miracles. From rational calculation, I think that yes, Russia will be in for a long and painful decay, which will last maybe decades.
This we speak about Russia and sort of as a state, but the state is made up of its citizens. And I would like to know, how do you think, um, what role does the public, the citizens themselves, play in forming Russia's future, its current policies, or is it truly an authoritarian state where the citizens follow the cues from the leaders?
I have had a good colleague recently died, Gleb Pavlovsky, the Russian political scientist. Also, many dislike him, hate him. He is one of the masterminds of the Putin system, who later became its critic. However, he was a very keen observer and a maker of the Russian political system. And the thing is, he never talked of the Russian people. He only talked of the population. And that's a key difference. In Russia, we don't have what we say narod. We don't have the people. We have the население. We have the population, which is rather a statistical mass. It's not a civil mass. So Putin was quite effective in deconstructing the Russian population and turning it into a state-organized groups, state-organized corporations, or what we call in Russian soslovia, estates. Russians are organized into state-led corporations of like siloviki, which we mentioned, or medics, or school teachers, or the various groups of budget receivers, the so-called byudzetniki, the municipal workers, the state corporations. So most of the like maybe 100 million people in Russia are in the state-fed sector. With pensioners, it's even more. So there's a very thin layer of people in Russia that are not dependent on the state. And in the state, the sense these are like the state-dependent people. And I'm not optimistic about the role of Russian people in reforming Russia. Actually, they almost never played such a role. Reform in Russia was always came from above or from the side, and it was inflicted by external circumstances. And then the people joined in when the government called upon them. The breakup of the Soviet Union was basically started from the top. And yes, of course, it was supported by the people in the national republics on the fringes, but they had their already a sort of national consciousness, national elites. In Russia, there is nothing of the kind. So I don't expect the people to take over, to take it to the streets and to reform Russia. These are, I mean, of course, different people and a lot of educated people and many people at heart are opposing this war. And they're basically my definition of Russia is that there's a, well, I wouldn't say good people, but okay, normal people are stuck in a bad system. The institutions are too corrupt and failing, and there is basically a rather educated population stuck in a clumsy and awkward system which they cannot take control of and they cannot change.
So maybe one last question on that topic. You know, you are Russian, even though you have worked all over Europe and you sort of work outside of Russia. But how did you get away from the propaganda? Because in your book, you describe a lot how the propaganda forms the opinions of the people. For example, on Ukraine, how the image of Ukraine as a bad little brother has propagated. So, what's your personal, I don't want to say story, but your personal view on the propaganda? How did you personally get away from it?
I don't know, by reading books, uh, like developing critical thinking, trying to think outside the box. No, I think I got away from this, mainstream discourse pretty early. I was like 20. Look, I was a pretty loyal Soviet schoolboy until the late 80s. Growing up in the system and believing in communism for a long time. Had a brief affair with orthodoxy, with religion. I was also religious for some time in life. So I was interested, and then, Gorbachev came, and then I thought that could be some kind of a, Prague Spring, the renovation of Soviet socialism, and was also hopeful for Gorbachev's reform for some time. So I was quite sort of following the mainstream discourse, not just propaganda, but actually much of the Russian philosophy supported this kind of a national discourse and, the special route for Russia, special path, the Russian civilization, the role of orthodoxy. Much of Russian political philosophy is also like non-critical. It's very much in the general state discourse. Yeah, but then my discovery happened at the end of the perestroika, and then I was reading from new books appeared, and then I traveled outside of Russia. I lived in Prague for some time. There I discovered interesting libraries and actually books in the Slovanska knihovna in the Slavic library. There were books from the early Russian emigration. And then I traveled to the US. I studied at Columbia University, and I was also exposed to a lot of alternative literature. And when I came back to Russia, to the Soviet Union still in 1990, I was already a reformed person. I had a very different mindset. I understood that communism is historically doomed and that Russia is more or less on the wrong track in history. And ever since then, I was sort of developing in this critical thinking, not about Russia, but about anything. I think any sort of the duty of any intellectual is to engage in critical thinking. Not, I learned it from the French philosophy, I would say, from the French critical thinkers, from the French left, that if you have an intellectual capacity, you should not put it to the service of the state. You should to the service of the authority. You should employ it, and that's what I taught my students. You should always employ your intellectual capacity in order to deconstruct and to question the authority, whichever they are. No matter whether you live in Russia, in America, in Germany, whatever. You should always be questioning things and seeing the relations of power and trying to release the freedom of the individual vis-a-vis the big institutions. So for me, since I'm a Russian, I was always using my critical capacity, critical thinking against trying to understand and to deconstruct the Russian state, the Russian Empire. And so I think in my case, it's like 30 years of such critical thinking.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we can conclude it there.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for this podcast. And
So, I think that was an amazing flood of information and analysis by Professor Medvedev. To summarize a little, I will now go over the interview to see how the professor's answers tie into the subject of political psychology. One of the things that interested me the most was the professor's answer to whether Vladimir Putin has acted alone. To what extent was the decision to invade Ukraine made on an individual level? Professor Medvedev has affirmed Vladimir Putin's role as the one who calls the shots. He described how the triggering decision for the invasion was made in a very small circle of the president's closest, whom we could see as the Tsar and his court, and that it came as a surprise to a large part of the Russian political and military elite. Thus, we cannot discount the influence of Vladimir Putin as an individual when talking about Russia, since it is an authoritarian state centered around his person. However, Professor Medvedev also described how the war was years in preparation, and that the decision itself was only the trigger. Different groups of interest participated on this preparation, and their interests do form a big part of Russia's policy. But perhaps surprisingly, Professor Medvedev also does not consider the influence of different groups of interest to be formative vis-a-vis Russian policy, in that they do not influence Russian policy, they only react to it and they profit off of it. We could imagine Russia as a massive, depersonalized machine with immense momentum to which the different actors, whether individual like the president himself or different groups of interest, have to conform. Going back to Vladimir Putin individually, to what extent can we consider his personal decision to invade Ukraine to be rational? Well, according to Professor Medvedev, it certainly wasn't a reckless decision. It was based on years of preparation and intelligence suggesting a swift victory. The problem was that the intelligence was wrong. It appears that Vladimir Putin himself did not act irrationally, but rather his agents did, reporting false intelligence out of fear of punishment for failure. As the war goes on, however, we could speak about a slide towards rationality. With more and more resources committed to the invasion, Russia becomes less willing to pull out of the war because of its sunk cost. To use Professor Medvedev's metaphor again, the machine is set on a course, and even removing Vladimir Putin from office would probably not end the war, as Russia as a whole is already committed, from the political and military elites down to the people. But why even attack? It seems that Russia gains nothing but ire, at least from the West, by attacking its smaller neighbor. Is it an irrational action? That depends on our point of view. As Professor Medvedev describes in his book and in our interview, Russia never gave up its imperial past. It still bases its modern identity on military power, and it never fully accepted the liberal world order. The invasion of Ukraine should not be viewed as war against a singular state, but as a war against the current status quo. If we accept that Russia does not seek to gain anything in the current system, but rather seeks to undermine it, we can perhaps begin to see the reasoning behind the invasion, even though we may not agree with it. Professor Medvedev describes Russia as an obsolete state, one that failed to reform in the 1990s after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it seeks to create a world in which its military power and its strong arm influence over its neighbors become relevant again. I was dismayed, although maybe not surprised, by Professor Medvedev's view on the end of the war. According to him, even should Ukraine win completely, restoring its borders to the pre 2014 state, Russia would not accept this, nor would it learn from it, but rather it would strengthen its resentment against the West, and it would accelerate Russia's fall towards a fascist authoritarian state, similar to Germany after World War I. Essentially, any result to the conflict, save perhaps Russia's complete victory, will be seen as a failure when compared to the original goal, and it will only fuel Russia's perception of loss. And I found even more depressing Professor Medvedev's opinion on the possibility of change from the bottom up. Originally, when I asked the question, I hoped that there could be hope that Russian citizens would be so fed up with the war that they would in some way rebel against the current leadership and they would at least force change in policy. But the professor holds a much more pessimistic view, seeing Russians more as an extension of the state, following its direction. And so it seems that reform can only come from the top, or from the outside. I'm glad that Professor Medvedev agreed to record this podcast with me. It was an amazing opportunity, and I thank him again for it. In case you are interested in more topics concerning political psychology, you can check out other podcasts by my colleagues from the Political Psychology and International Relations course here on the channel. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.